You're listening to And the Plot Thickens, an Authors on the Air Radio Network podcast. Join your host, suspense and horror writer Jeff Crawford, as he explores the art of creating tension and mood with authors from a wide variety of genres. Find out more about Jeff and his books at authorjeffcrawford.com. And now, meet today's author guest.
Welcome to And the Plot Thickens, part of the Authors on the Air Global Network. I'm your host, Jeff Crawford, and my producer is Carrie Schaefer. Today's guest is writer, publisher, collaborative partner, screenplay writer, frequent guest speaker, and panelist. Welcome to the show, Richard Chizmar.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an honor. When I first began doing this show, I was told that I could have anyone on here that I wanted, but Richard Chizmar was the guy that I had to get on the calendar. So I've been looking forward to this for a while.
I appreciate that.
If you're acquainted at all with this show, then you know that there are a lot of spokes, but suspense is the hub of the wheel.
Okay.
Let's say you're taking a walk or waiting in line at the burger joint or watching a ball game, and a new idea for a work hits you. What do you do next?
Oh, it depends. If I'm by myself, I'm scribbling I'm stopping, I'm scribbling in my phone as quick as I can, unless I have my laptop or pad of paper handy. But my phone gets a lot of work, the memo section. I tend to wake up in the middle of the night with certain thoughts in my head and scribble on my phone. And fortunately, my wife knows by now that that's what I'm doing. And I'm not messaging with some Swedish woman across the ocean or something. Setting up some, black market business deal in the middle of the night. But yeah, if I'm taking a walk or doing something like that and I'm by myself, then yeah, I always make sure I'm down. I've learned my lesson. I can't tell you how many times I've thought, that is such an interesting idea or such an interesting thought. I'll remember it. How could I ever forget it? And within an hour, I'm like, what the hell was I, what was it? So after enough of those instances, I always write it down. But yeah, if I'm with a group of people, I don't hesitate to say, I got to write this down real quick so I don't forget it. But then, I'm on to at least attempting to be social.
Sure. Okay. I'm not exactly sure how to ask this. And it's not twitchy. It's just,
Right.
I got to make sure I get my train of thought into it the way it's supposed to be. Does the nature of the book or the characters in the book dictate how you build the suspense, or do you have a set method in mind going into it? And I ask that because it's different from the outline question we always get, because personalities of characters and places evolve during the book is the reason I'm asking it that way.
Right. No, that's a really good question. I don't do kind of, you touched on outlines. I don't really, I say that, and I have to be honest. I was about to say, I don't really work from outlines, which is connected to the larger part of your question, but it's not really true anymore. I never used to work from outlines. But I know, with the Gwendy books that I did with Steve, with the first one, when I got a big chunk of pages and he said, yeah, if you can finish it, go ahead and give it a shot. I did kind of outline, just in the form of a broad roadmap, some main points that I wanted to connect the dots between. And it ended up turning into a little bit more of a traditional outline than I thought. But other than that, there's one novella I've written called A Long December, which was, probably about 30,000 words, that I did end up outlining because there was a lot going on. And then with Chasing the Boogeyman, I did outline it, and it wasn't intentional. Again, it was like started as, hey, I want to make sure I don't want to forget these points that I think are interesting, plot points. And then I ended up connecting the dots in an outline form, and it made writing the books go so much quicker. And I just finished the sequel to Boogeyman, and the same thing. I ended up outlining it pretty extensively, and it helped me write, the book in 4 months instead of probably 8 or 9. Just because I already had, and it, I didn't strictly adhere to it. I didn't feel, boxed in by anything I had written. It just kind of fulfilled that roadmap,
Right.
but it was just like, it's kind of like going on a road trip where it's like, yeah, I'm gonna, I got my course pre-plotted, but I'm gonna wander. And that's exactly what happened. So it's interesting. I've been saying, no, I'm not an outliner in interviews for 20 years, 30 years. And now I kind of got to change if I'm being truthful. But so then to go on to the larger part of your question about whether specific character traits and these characters kind of dictate, how they interact with the suspenseful moments and kind of the darkness of the story. Not really. I mean, I want to say, sure, if this character has, certain traits, like she's, if this female character or male character is a little on the, the antsy side, she's not a fan of being out alone in the dark, or he's not a fan of being at home by himself at night, those kind of things. And you know what? Yeah, that a character like that is prime for authorly abuse. I for a lack of a better way to put it, you can have some fun because, you're going to be able to put that person through the ringer a little bit more than the average person.
Right.
Who's content with the doors locked and deadbolted. They're like, yeah, nothing's getting in. But for that other type person, they're thinking maybe something already got in before I locked. So in that regard, yeah, those kind of small but important personality traits. But for the most part, I'm one of those writers who, and I just finished saying I'm outlining, but I kind of just go where the story takes me. So, and I do interject a lot of my own personal fears into the story, and I have plenty of those. So people make fun of me all the time. They're like, it must be that huge imagination of yours. And I'm like, yeah, I've been like this since I was a kid, which is why I do this stuff, because hey, I still scare myself. But yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, that's what we do. We exercise certain things,
Or we try.
whether yeah, whether we meant to or not. You touched on something that I want to bring up. You've collaborated with some heavy duty writers. Is there a measure of suspense involved with that for you, or is it laid out to know by and large what to expect from your partner? And I say that because I say that because I've worked on one collaborative piece, and
Right.
I never knew what was coming, and I stayed on edge the whole time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you know what and if work with say 2 or 3 more writers and do it again and again, I think you'll find that you probably have the same answer that I'm going to give you, which is it's totally dependent on each instance. There's times I've collaborated on a handful of short stories with some great writers like Brian Freeman and Brian Keene and Ray Garton and others, and my son on longer pieces. And in some of those cases, it's a short story, so there's not too much mystery, and there's not you're not kept too much in the blind because you don't have a lot of room to roam. So things are kind of talked about, even whether it's just a casual conversation, like hey, yeah, I think I'm going to take it here, and then the other person says, well, wait till you get my part because you might have a hard time taking it all the way there, but you might do this or that kind of thing. Whereas with and somewhere in the middle, when I collaborated with my son Billy on Widow's Point, we figured out really early on that I was stronger in the flashback scenes and the more narrative driven scenes, and he was stronger in the scenes where our main character was really spiraling out of control and losing it, and the prose wasn't nearly as neatly formed, and it was more free flowing and out there. And it became really apparent that that's where our strengths were in this particular story. So we kind of left that, those those roles to be fulfilled by each of us, throughout the story, regardless of page count. I might have had a long section and then he had a very short section, and then we flip it over and he had a long section where this guy was losing it and I had a short section where I came back. So it all worked out. And then there's the instances with Steve King, particularly in the last book of the trilogy, Gwendy's Final Task, which was the only full-length novel really, of the trilogy, because the first one was really just a novelette. The second one, they said it was a novel, and it technically is, but it's a short novel. The third one, we did 50-page chunks and just traded them back and forth, and we did not tell each other where we were going. So yeah, in that regard, it was really neat. It was, it felt, I remember texting Steve several times, just saying, to me, this is what a collaboration should feel like. It's just this challenging but fun exercise. We're not trying to write each other into a corner or anything like that, but we're just writing and, without giving a whole lot of thought to necessarily what comes next, trusting the other person.
Right.
Go, tap them on the shoulder and say, it's your turn.
Yeah, that's it.
And that was neat. I wouldn't have even thought to put, and I'm not giving, this isn't giving, it's not a spoiler, but because it's on the dust jacket, but I wouldn't even thought to put Gwendy Peterson in space, on a spaceship. That was all Steve. And then, I remember I wrote the part where we go back to Derry, Maine, which is the setting for It, which is my all-time favorite novel. And I didn't do it because I wanted to play in that area of the sandbox. It's just, to me, that's where the story took me.
Right.
But I do remember after I finished those 50 pages, sending it to Steve and thinking, oh man, that was a big ballsy move on my part, and I hope he doesn't hate it. And he loved it, and he made it so much better when he sent it back, because that's essentially what we did. Is whenever one of us would receive a chunk of pages, we would go through, do a light edit, and then continue from there. And I think that's why it kind of became difficult to figure out who started where and who ended where. So yeah, and
Cool.
each different, but that was the one where no idea what was coming next, and I loved every minute of it.
That's great. That's great. Here's the question that I ask everyone who comes on the show, because the answers are so varied, and I like every one of them. In your opinion, which scares the reader more, fear of the known or fear of the unknown?
It's a really good question. And I've never been asked that, and that's rare. I want to give a cheating answer from start to finish and say it totally depends on that reader. And in some ways that's not a cheating answer, because they're, I use me as an example, and it's like, and I'm sure people have said this, maybe not an answer to this question, but using Pet Sematary as an example. Pet Sematary is a completely different book when I read it when I was in college than it was when I read it 15 years later when I had kids. So that's a good example of a book where when I read it in college, it was probably the fear of the unknown, because what the hell was it in that burial plot back in the woods, past the deadfall and the Pet Sematary. But then when I was a parent, I was terrified of what I already knew was
Right.
happen, and just the perils of everyday life before you even get some crazy guy like Steve King even mixed into it. So yeah, I guess it has to be my answers. It just really depends. But, for me, I've always been more frightened by, human monsters and, what we're capable of, and the masks that, from a really early age, I was kind of aware, even while I grew up in this, kind of semi-idyllic, suburban neighborhood, and even walking the streets back when you could, late at night, you're spending the night with your buddy and you guys sneak out and you walk down to 7-Eleven to get a Slurpee and a Slim Jim and play some Space Invaders. And you're walking back and there's the comforting glow and the lights in the windows and all that. And I was always the warped kid telling stories to scare my friends, telling scary stories. But I was always really aware of the fact that, we were in this seemingly peaceful place, but that none of us were really truly aware of what was going on behind those closed doors and those closed drapes, and that a lot of people wore masks that kind of hid their true selves, and
Right.
That's always scared me more than the idea of vampires and, things that go like, and I think that reflects itself in most of my work.
I think that's a great answer. And I think you're right. I think when you sit and think about it, I think the answer probably changes. The maturation process goes on.
Right.
It just has to.
And then you take a book
What's
like
the
which is so, and again, I'll get off the Steve King appreciation trail here, but
that's all right. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, you kind of can't help it sometimes when you're answering good questions. They kind of probe into you, and if you're a fan, you're a fan. But I'm thinking a book like Salem's Lot, where you know what, he did pull that magic trick where he made me terrified of vampires and people turning into vampires. But at the same time, he paints such a detailed, rich portrait of the town and the townsfolks that you get to hear about the bus driver with the bad temper, and you get to hear about the alcoholic and the one who's beating his wife and all of that. So it's like equal measures there. And I think it's partly what's responsible for his wild success all these years, is that he introduces you either to people that you know in your own life or to people that you would never want to know. But
right.
Each subset is so real that you can't help but feel like you're part of it. And then you throw in some vampires in the mix, and that's why it's such a classic novel,
I agree. What's the most important thing about writing dark or tense or edgy that you know now that you didn't know when you wrote your first book?
It's I haven't written that many books. It feels like I have because there's been a lot of them lately, but I've written a lot of short stories, written some novellas and things like that. And then there was about a 10-year period where there was nothing new because I was just working on the business and on the book business, and I was writing some film stuff. But I just know this. I always tell writers when I'm talking about, when they ask advice or they try to talk about my arc as a writer, my progression. And I always just say, I look at those stories I was writing back in my 20s, and they're just, they're not authentic. And by that, I don't mean they're poorly researched or they're just, I put together a collection years ago of my really early stories for a really small edition that would never be reprinted because the stories are really bad, but people wanted to read them, and they were scattered in all these small press magazines. So I put them together, and I was writing the introduction to it. And what struck me is how many of these stories were set in cities, how many of these stories were, urban horror stories, and how many were, about, dysfunctional, evil, family matters. And I remember thinking to myself, what the hell was I doing? Because I don't live in the city. I rarely go to the city. And I figured out after the fact that I was writing to try to sell to different markets. And in a lot of those cases, they were looking for those kind of stories. So, you know what? Nothing wrong with that. I was trying to earn my chops in the small press, and I was trying to sell. But I was writing stories fit for a market instead of writing stories that came truly from inside of me. And I can really, the first story where I really kind of hit my stride was one called A Crime of Passion. And it was an interesting juxtaposition between the suburbs and urban living and crime, and how, there's a really thin line between where it originates from and where it prospers. And it had a lot of heart to it. And what I figured out eventually is that's kind of where I hit my pace as far as kind of having the courage to put part of myself in these stories, how I viewed the world, whether it was in a large, manner, or whether it was just a moment in time or a person or a place that felt very, I'm going to use that word again, authentic to me. And it compelled me to write about it. And once I started writing those stories is when I kind of hit my pace and started selling to larger markets and had people respond to my stories, because, it wasn't a 5-page story about a guy living in a tenement apartment who is abusive and a monster comes out of his beer and attacks him. I was writing these EC comic stories, which I love, but they weren't real. They weren't, they just didn't have a lot of honesty to them.
Right.
And that's a word I use a lot talking about writers, and it's just like, you know, it takes courage, and obviously a different definition of the kind of courage that, soldiers or our police officers and a lot of other people put on the line every day. But a different kind of courage to kind of expose a part of yourself, and to be
Right.
honest with the world, and not be afraid to be laughed at or told that, hey, this isn't important. I don't know why you took the time to write it on paper. So that's what I always tell writers is most of us have something worth saying, and you just kind of have to have the confidence to put it out there. And once I figured that out, like I said, that's when I kind of started hitting. That's the best really give to that one, and it's a very personal one. So I don't know if other people would feel that way, but for me, that's what worked.
Well, that's great. And I agree. I think you do your best work when you throw more of yourself into it. Not necessarily autobiographical, but when who was it? Was it Hemingway that said to write, you just sit down and bleed?
Yeah, you open up
and
on the page essentially. Yeah, and it doesn't even have to, it doesn't even have to always be a lot of blood. Sometimes it's bittersweet. It's nostalgic.
Yeah.
It's
sometimes it's fun stuff. Sometimes it's good stuff, and sometimes there's briars and nettles there. But
and again, some people, they might do better. Maybe they'll say, hey, once I kind of started, hiding or obstructing myself, that's when I had success. But for me, it was the opposite. It was just once I kind of, trusted myself to tell the story I wanted to tell, it was there. And I learned that from a writer named Ed Gorman, who passed away years ago. He was a good friend, but Ed could write. And for any viewers who aren't familiar with his work, which probably are a lot, because Ed was one of those writers who deserved bestsellerdom, but that never really came. But he wrote horror, mystery, suspense, science fiction, fantasy, westerns, crime, cozies, everything. But it's Gorman, and you go to eBay, you can find his books everywhere. But Ed is one of those writers, and Joe Lansdale was another one for me. And also because those early stories of mine, I always felt like I had to kind of reinvent the wheel. I was always trying to write intricately plotted stories, and I wasn't, good enough to do them justice, which showed. But what I learned from Ed and Joe is sometimes you could write a 10-page story about a mom on a bus stop, bench with a little girl. And you could tell their story in those 10 pages and where they were in their lives. And if you told it with heart and feeling and honesty, it was just as interesting as a 40-page story that read like a roller coaster.
Right.
Both of those writers taught me that with some of their stories. I remember just thinking, wow, this story wasn't about a whole lot, but it was about life. It was about, more than is what's on the page.
Right.
That's such a neat thing to be able to accomplish. And again, it made me feel like, hey, I'm no Joe Lansdale, and I'm certainly no Ed Gorman, but I have stories like that to tell. They really affected me. And particularly Ed, you could write a story about a hitman, trying to get away from the business, and a run-in with an older woman who reminded him of his mom at a phone booth, and their 3-page interaction, which changed the course of both their lives. And he could accomplish all that in 8 pages. And it was just this wonderful ability of his. And I learned a lot from that. Don't stop trying to reinvent the wheel, and just tell the story that matter to you.
That's fantastic. Before we run out of time, tell everybody about the latest thing you've got cooking and where they can find it and you.
I'm on, all the social media things, which I thought I'd hate, but I ended up really liking, because I could meet people who read books and watch movies and interact with my old friends who I haven't seen in years. So I'm on all the different, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Have my own website, richardchizmar.com. And what's out for me right now, I had the paperback of a book called Chasing the Boogeyman, just came out a couple months ago. And about a month before that, the third Gwendy book with Steve King, Gwendy's Final Task, came out. So I'll be spending October doing a bunch of book signings out and about, and I'll post a schedule on my website. And
great.
sequel to Chasing the Boogeyman. So That'll come out sometime next year. And as soon as I know, I'll let everybody else know.
Fantastic. Well, folks, you've been listening to a conversation with a terrific guest. Richard, I hope you'll come back so we can continue this discussion one day.
Absolutely.
And I hope I hope everyone out there will pick up every book they can find with your name on the cover.
Thank you.
This has been another installment of The Plot Thickens. I'm Jeff Crawford, and you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and on the Plot Thickens page on Facebook. If you want to know more about the books that I've written, all are available through Amazon. Remember to read a book and tell everyone that you've read it. Reviews do matter. Join us next time for another interesting conversation with another fascinating author. And AM, hang in there, buddy. We're all pulling for you.